Okay, thank you everybody for joining. Tonight we are continuing our shiur on the Tefillah, and we just finished Uval Etzion last week. Tonight we're continuing with the order of the Sfaradi Siddur. Sfaradi Siddur, unlike the Ashkenaz Siddur, after Uval Etzion and a Kaddish, we have a section, depending on which Siddur you're using, which includes the Shir Shel Yom and then Ein Ke'Elokeinu. And there is what to say on Shir Shel Yom, but not much. This is a minhag. Uh, I wanted to reserve tonight for the minhag hasfaradi, where we say Ein Ke'Elokeinu every day. I know the Ashkenazim, you might be a little confused if you're listening to this. You say Ein Ke'Elokeinu only on Shabbat, but this short piyut, I think, is more worthy of attention. If we have time in the coming weeks, we'll discuss a little bit more about the Shir Shel Yom and the Pesukim revolving around that. Maybe tonight we'll get to it a little bit, but I wanted to start with discussing Ein Ke'Elokeinu. And the reason for that is because, at least for Ashkenazim, we'll cover it now, but this is a piyut and a portion of our tefillah, which has probably received the least attention in the Siddur, in my opinion. When you look at almost any Siddur that contains a commentary, almost any Siddur that contains some sort of sources, Ein Ke'Elokeinu is always the least information dense. There's very, very little data on Ein Ke'Elokeinu, and I wanted to remedy that. I wanted to try to tell a story where there isn't one, and paint a narrative of the work that's been done into understanding this short piyut. And if you aren't familiar with it, you should open a siddur to the end of davening. Either if you're Ashkenaz, look at it again. It goes something like this: Ein Ke'Elokeinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Kadonenu, Mi Kemalkeinu, Mi Kemoshienu. And the same with Noda, Baruch, and Atahu Elokeinu. That's the entire piyut. And in order to understand it, I'm going to do it in different stages. Let's start with this. Where's the earliest time we find this in the Siddur? Since there's so little work on this that's been done, let's just start with where's the first time we see it. And the answer is in the Seder of Amram Gaon. In the Seder of Amram Gaon, after the Tefillah of Shachrit, he puts it there. In some of the versions of the Seder of Amram Gaon, and the Master Vitri makes this clear, it would say V'hamidaktikin, and those who are prudent will say it every single day. And this handwritten version I have here, this is a JTS version. You'll see if you can make it out here. I'm not sure if I have my mouse is pointing, but it says v'nohagim lo markach, right? V'achas shesayim shliach tzibor aseh shalom nohagim lo markach. Ein Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Kadonenu, Mi Kemalkeinu, Mi Kemoshienu. In Rav Amram Gaon's order, his begins with Mi Kadonenu. And in fact, many of the early Rishonim refer to this tefillah not as Ein Ke'Elokeinu, which is how it's known today, but rather they know it as Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Kadonenu. So the first place we see it is here in the Seder of Amram Gaon. So far, not so interesting. What a little bit about that, which is interesting, is that you find in the Seder of Saadia Gaon, Rav Saadia Gaon doesn't know about it. He doesn't talk about it, never mentions it. As far as I know, Rav Saadia Gaon is completely unaware, or it's not as custom to say Ein Ke'Elokeinu in Shachrit. The version in Seder of Amram is very similar to ours, the Sfaradi, but the Ashkenazi, the order is different. And it's exactly where the Sfaradim expected. At the end of Shachrit, Shalchol, the Ashkenazim will only say it at the end of the Shachrit. At the end of the Shachrit on Shabbat. Now, the interesting thing about this minhag is that the Rishonim provide us with yet another minhag for when to say Ein Ke'Elokeinu. One of those minhagim is after the Arvit. I believe this was the Persian and Romanian minhag, unless I'm misremembering. The minhag was to say it after Arvit of Shabbat. Some people had this minhag. We find this in some manuscripts. But the most dominant minhag that we find was the Provençal minhag. I should say the most, not the most dominant, but the most popular alternative minhag was to do it after Shabbat. So Motzei Shabbat after Arvit, before Havdalah, they would say Ein Ke'Elokeinu. This was the minhag in southern France, in Provence. We see this attested to in the Sefer HaManhig from the Ravan. And we also see this in the Sefer of the Pirush HaTefillah to Yehuda ben Yakar, he also claims that they would do it on Motzei Shabbat. Why? Okay, they give a very interesting reason. They say because the Shabbat is like a kala who's yotza mechupata. The Shabbat is like a kala who just went through her chuppah. And if everybody abandons the Shabbat right after Shabbat, the Shabbat would be offended. Therefore, Shabbat after Shabbat, we do bisamim as if we're being mevasem the kala, and we sing songs on Motzei Shabbat. This is an early Sfaradim minhag to sing Zmirot on Motzei Shabbat in order to accompany the Shabbat Malkita with kavod, and that was the minhag in Provence. The Ashkenazi and the Italian sources, namely Machzor Vitri, Shibbolei Haleket, Sidur Rashi, Sefer Apardes, etc. Or I think even Orchot Chaim brings this, even though he's Provençal. The alternative explanation was that they would only do it on Shachrit of Shabbat, after Shachrit of Shabbat. They have a completely different theory. So we have two different times to say it, and two different explanations come as to why we say it. The explanation for the Ashkenazim and the Italians is different. They say that the whole reason we say it is because on Shabbat we are short berachot. We all know that we have to say 100 brachot every day. Yet on Shabbat, we have 3 Shmona Esreis, which instead of having 18 or 19 brachot, they have only 7 brachot. And therefore, we're missing, I think it's roughly 10 from each, 11 from each. And we have to compensate. And so they have different cheshponot. Each Rishon has his own funny way of doing it. But essentially, well, we'll take, let's say one example is you'll take Ein Ke'Elokeinu, Ein Ke'Malkeinu, Ein Ke'Moshenu. That's five stanzas of 4 nicknames for Hashem, 4 kinuyim for Hashem. That's almost like you're saying Baruch Atah Hashem 20 times. And that's how you fill up as if you were missing 20 brachot. And if you look at the acrostic, they say the correct order is Ein Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Ke'Elokeinu, and Noda Le'Elokeinu, which is Aleph Mem Nun, Amen, and then Baruch, and then Ata. So it's Amen, Baruch Ata. It's just like you're saying a bracha. The Sfaradi Nusach was similar to Seder of Amram. And the Seder of Amram would have first the Mem, Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Kadonenu, Mi Ke'Malkeinu. Therefore, the Provençal Rishonim say, En Bazeh Shoresh Ve'anaf, there is no credence to this claim. This is a silly thing that the French and the Ashkenazim say. There's no such thing as being Mekayem your 20 extra brachot, really 30, that you need for Shabbat by saying Ein Ke'Elokeinu. That's not its purpose. That's not why it was written. And they say if you want to fulfill the brachot, eat candies. Just like the Gemara says. I think it was Rava. The Gemara on Shabbat says that Rava would eat different candies and sweets on Shabbat to fulfill his minyan of Mea Brachot B'chol Yom. So this is the machloket we have. The Rishonim clearly do not have a real clear Misorah as to the genesis and to the authorship of Ein Ke'Elokeinu, but there's 2 Misorot, there's 2 different traditions that were either invented or evolved or that they received, which for explanations for why Ein Ke'Elokeinu was written, what its function is, and even what its order was. Now, when it comes to actually researching maybe where this came from, there was unfortunately very little work done on this. In his book on let me see if my slides are correct. Yeah, the order of my slides are not yet correct. Give me 1 second. In his book on synagogue poetry, Leopold Suns was one of the first scholars to take a look at this and at least make a comment. So if you didn't know, and I'll share my screen with you now. Hold on. Leopold Suns was one of the founders of the Reform movement and the Jewish Reform movement. He was a towering scholar of Judaic studies, and he was a genius of geniuses. Yet his religious positions and controversial opinions aside, he was the pioneer of study of Jewish liturgy and Jewish poetry and Jewish hymnography, I should say. He began the whole field of studying tefillah and piyut before anybody. And here pictured on the right is Leopold Suns. And what's fascinating is that, in his training, his training was really in philology, and he invented a field. He literally invented an academic field, and he laid the groundwork for everybody else who came after him. But he makes very few comments, and his comments are as follows. He says that he puts Ein Ke'Elokeinu in a list of piyutim that were written for Shabbat in the Gaonic period. What that tells you is that he believes that it was written in the Gaonic period and that it was written primarily for Shabbat, meaning Shabbat day. And he describes it as a litany, meaning a very simple type of poetry. A litany is something like Hodu Lashem Kitov Kilam Chasto, Yom Yisrael Kilam Chasto, or Hoshana, Hoshana, Hoshana. That's a litany. And finally, he says that the acrostic of Amen Baruch Atah is probably not a coincidence. To me, this sounds like that. This sounds like Professor Zunz was only familiar with the Ashkenaz version and didn't think very deeply about it. The most deeply he thought about it was that to him, Ein Ke'Elokeinu, and this is roughly in like 1865, to him, Ein Ke'Elokeinu was a piyut that we had lost its origins to. The Rishonim were familiar with it. Clearly, it was written in the time of the Geonim, and the minhag of the Ashkenazim was the one he knew of, to say it after Shachrit of Shabbat, and to say the acrostics of Amen Baruch Atah. When you move on a little bit, we find another scholar who makes a comment in the 1880s. And this is actually not a Jewish scholar. This is the famous Dr. Charles Taylor, the Hebraist, the Christian Hebraist of Cambridge, of really the master of St. John's College. Now, the reason Charles Taylor is famous in the Jewish world is because the Taylor Schechter collection of the Cairo Geniza is named after him. Charles Taylor was a friend of Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter, in case you didn't know, is the architect of the Jewish conservative movement. He was also a towering scholar of rabbinics, and he became the reader in rabbinics in Cambridge University in England. And he used to give a shiur, like a class, every Tuesday, which the most distinguished professors in Cambridge would attend. And Dr. Taylor, even though he was 10 years older than Solomon Schechter, he was a big Talmud of his. He was a huge fan, and he would learn at his feet like a Talmud to a Rebbe. He thought Rabbi Schechter was the greatest thing ever. He was a tremendous fan of the Rabbanim, and he was a tremendous admirer of the Sifrei HaRabbanim, of Sifrei Chazal, and he became a very respected Christian Hebraist. And he respected Solomon Schechter a lot, so much so that he sponsored Solomon Schechter's expedition to the Cairo Geniza. And because he sponsored it, till today, it's called the Taylor Schechter collection. And in 1886, I think it was 86. Yeah, he published a book called, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with any Christian works. It's called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And on page 78 there, he says that there's a passage in the Christian Bible where it says Amen, and then the next words are "Come, Lord," etc. Now he thinks that Amen and then Bo, right? Amen and then the Hebrew word Beis Aleph are a typical thing to find in Hebrew. And he says, look, in Revelations, we find Amen Bo, and in Jewish liturgy, you find the same thing. Look at the Jewish tefillah. If you open a siddur, sometimes you'll see the words Amen Bo. He's talking about the manuscript siddurim. And he says, Ein Ke'Elokeinu mikadonenu nodal Elokeinu, those acrostics are Amen Bo, and clearly the writers of that piyut had this expression in Hebrew, Amen Bo. And so, too, that's why the acrostics in the siddurim are Amen Bo for this Ein Ke'Elokeinu prayer. And it's kind of funny. I mean, Solomon Schechter, a few years later in 1892, he mentions, he was a big friend of Taylor, so he doesn't insult him, but that's not how Hebrew works. I mean, everybody here who learns Lashon HaKodesh, anyone watching or listening to this shiur who's familiar with Lashon HaKodesh knows that there's no such expression, there's no such word combination of Amen Bo that doesn't exist in Hebrew. It's a nice try, very cute, but that's not it. Amen Bo is really just in the manuscripts is just a shorthand for Ein Ke'Elokeinu or Amen Baruch Atah Hashem. And Schechter himself comments that most likely the addition of Mi Ke'Elokeinu with the mem first, that's probably the right order. And he also found a manuscript which has this correct order, and he also gave another one. Forgive me if I cycle very quickly. He found another manuscript, and I'm sorry I'm not showing it here. Oh, no, this is not it. I'm sorry. But he found a manuscript which he showed Yisrael Abramson Yisrael Abrams, and that also had the other version of Ein Ke'Elokeinu first. And also at the end of it, it says V'hi Noam Hashem Elokeinu L'aseh Adinu Kunaneu, which seems to be that Salman Schechter found in the Geniza a manuscript where after the Ein Ke'Elokeinu says V'hi Noam, which sounds like that manuscript was part of a Sidur for Motzei Shabbat. So the scholars of this period of the early 1900s began to believe that Ein Ke'Elokeinu was originally a poem written for Motzei Shabbat, a kind of simple litany, a simple song. Nobody could date it whatsoever. Nobody had a way of dating this poem, but it was clearly old and clearly a very simple litany. Even if we say that, if you just stop and think about all this for just a second, even if you say that it's really old and that it was written for Motzei Shabbat, let's say you take that for granted that it was written for Motzei Shabbat. Why in the world would people start saying this on Shachrit? Why in the world would people start saying this after Shachrit of Shabbat? Why would people start saying this after Arvit? The whole idea that they entertained in the early 1900s that this was originally written for before Havdalah or the Tefillot Motzei Shabbat is really questionable, because why say that that's the original just because that was the Minhag Provençal? Maybe the Ashkenaz version was the original. Maybe the Sfaradi custom was the original. There's no way to prove, since all of these sources are so early, whether it's Seder of Amram, whether it's these early manuscripts, there's really no way to prove which one came first and where it started. If you tell me that it started, by Arvitz, maybe I could see how it came to Motzei Shabbat, but they have nothing. One tefillah has nothing to do with the other. The Motzei Shabbat and Arvit Shel Shabbat, and the Shachrit of Chol and Shachrit Shel Shabbat, these are different tefillot with different purposes. So it doesn't really make sense. Perhaps, and I'm really conjecturing here, perhaps it was just the music, and every kehillah found a version of this music which appealed to them. And frankly, if you search on YouTube for Ein Ke'Elokeinu, you will find the Ladino version. There are many cultures in Judaism, there's even a Yiddish version. Many cultures developed a song for Ein Ke'Elokeinu, which included their vernacular. I think the song is Ein Ke'Elokeinu, I'm forgetting the tune. Hold on. No more. I'm sorry. I wish I could sing it for you, but of course, when you're under pressure, you forget. But if you look on YouTube, you'll find it. It's the Ladino version of Ein Ke'Elokeinu. I'm forgetting. Okay, I'm not gonna embarrass myself on recording. Okay, so it could be that I'm conjecturing it could be the music was what propelled it to become a popular song, and perhaps people said it at the end of a tefillah simply because they wanted to, like almost like a yigdal today in a Moroccan shul. I just don't have another conjecture for how it could have spread. Now, roughly 30 years later, and this is the next progression in this, we just have one very small comment by Ismail Elbogen in his Sefer al Tefillah, his textbook on Tefillah. He simply comments that most likely the Mikadonenu is the original. That's it. And we basically don't have any scholarship on Ein Ke'Elokeinu for another almost like 80 years. It wasn't until 1987 where somebody named Meir Bar-Ilan, he's a professor in Bar-Ilan University and today professor emeritus, and he began one of his first, I think this is his first monograph of his career, with a very interesting project. And his project was studying the tefillot that exist in the Safrut Heichalot v'Hamerkava. So let me take a step back, and I'm going to explain to you what the Safrut, what is the Sifrei HaHeichalot, what are the so-called Heichalot literature that he was studying. And this is a bit of a complicated topic, so I'm going to try to summarize it as best I could. In case you aren't aware, there is an early form of medrash in rabbinics and Chazal, which are simply usually just called the Heichalot, the Sifrei Heichalot. And it's a very unhelpful abstraction, because overall there's roughly 25 smaller works that are called Sifrei Heichalot. You have Heichalot Rabbati, Heichalot Sujati, you have Chanoch, you have Shiur Koma, there's Sefer Raziel Hamalach, There is Sefer, I don't know. There's Masechet Merkava, I think Maseh Bereshit, Maseh Merkava. There's a really almost 25 smaller books which are called the Safrut Heichalot, the literature of the Heichalot. These are very early medrash style mystical texts that some people attributed to Chazal. And they said that these were written by Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yishmael or other Tanoim. And these were midrashim that were attributed to Chazal from a very early stage. And if you look at the Gemara in the Mishnah and Chagiga, you'll see as follows. The Mishnah says, famous Mishnah in Chagiga, Perek, Beis, Ein Darshan B'Arayot B'Shlosha, V'lo B'Maaseh B'Reishit B'Shnayim, V'lo B'Merkava B'Yachid, Elam Kein Haya Chacham U'Mevin Midato. Essentially, the Mishnah here is commanding regulation that certain mystical topics cannot be taught to students unless you have, it's only one-on-one or one-on-two. Essentially, so Arayot is not really a mystical topic, but Maaseh Bereshit, if it's talking about the acts of creation, you can't do it with two people, you have to do one-on-one. If it's Maaseh Merkava, you can't even do it one-on-one unless the person is very, very wise. What this tells us is that according to the Tanaim, there is a field of Limud HaTorah, which is called Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshit. And more than this, we really don't know from the time of the Tanaim. All we know is that we have a Gemara and Chagiga with a Braita, but we don't really know so much about their worldview. Now, this is, when you look through the Maaseh, these books, they roughly fall into about four categories. There's a category of books which are Maaseh Bereshit. They discuss how the worlds and the upper worlds came into being. What are the roles of the angels and how were they created? What are the different palaces and gateways in Shemayim and when they were created? There's a Maaseh Merkava, which describe the experience. That's the second genre, which describe the experience of Tanoim, who are going to try to see visions of the divine while they are alive, and the so-called heavenly chariot and all the visions similar to Yecheskel. Those books of Maaseh Merkava are books like Heichalot Rabbati and Zutrati. These are Sfarim attributed to people like Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, and it goes through their visions of how they saw the Heichalot in Shemayim. Then you have the Sefer Yetzirah, which is just a larger text on its own. It's very unique text, which deals with the creation of the world. And finally, you have what's called like the magic books, the books like Raziel HaMalach and things that speak about angels and potions, angelology, and how to use different Shemot Hashem to get what you want. So some of these books have been given more canonicity, more sanctity than other Sfarim throughout the Jewish Orthodox history. If you go throughout the time if you look at our Mesorah, so to speak, there has been more, let's call it, respect and veracity and sanctity given to a sefer like Sefer Yetzirah than to a sefer like Shiur Koma. You take a sefer like Shiur Koma, which tries to give you mystical measurements of the Godhead, of the corporeal or incorporeal ideas of God's quote unquote measurements. Take a book like that, and some of the Rishonim gave it respect, and the Rambam said you should burn it. The Rambam commanded people, you have a book like that, burn it. Or Sadia Gaon said, well, maybe it's mezuyaf, maybe it's forged. He didn't really want to say it's a forgery outright because he had the Karaim, and the Karaim wanted him to say that all of Torah Shebaal Peh was a forgery. So Sadia Gaon was much more careful. But there are Sefarim in the Sefer Heichalot, which we have to be careful about because we don't know, even if the Sefer in the Heichalot is legitimate, we don't know if parts of it were forged and parts of it had things that are added in later. So even in the history of the Rishonim are careful speaking about the Safrut Heichalot. Regardless, it affected all fields of Kabbalah, whether it's the Kabbalah of the Hasidut Ashkenaz, whether it's the Kabbalah of Spain, whether it's the Kabbalah of the Arizal, or all forms of Kabbalah. The Safrut Heichalot, the literature of the Sfarim of Heichalot, had a profound effect on all of these systems. And the reason is very pashut. You have to stop and think for a second. If you casually peruse the Heichalot Rabbati or the Sefer Yetzirah, you'll realize that this mystical system, this mystical experience, this worldview, is very far into us. It's very detached and other from our world experience. And it is so foreign to and such a different worldview from us that nobody could easily fit it into their understanding or to their system of understanding of Yiddishkeit and of the Torah. It's just so different. It speaks about the Kisei HaKavod and the angels and people turning into angels and different conversations in the heavens and visions of Hashem's glory and the throne and different gates of Shemayim and different meditations to get there and different combinations of Shem Hashem. And it's just a very different mystical system. And it's honestly, when you look at Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel as halachic figures, you're very confused. Like, these are the same people speaking about these very fantastical ideas and these very like strange books of angelology. It's just very odd. And nobody, whether it was secular Jews or devout Jews, could easily fit the Safrut Heichalot into their worldview or into their system of how Torah works. Therefore, the Heichalot have always been a very fringe area of expertise, and very few people, even in the time of the Rishonim, would study it or become familiar with the Safrut Heichalot. Even when you get to modern times, people were the modern scholars were actually very embarrassed. They were embarrassed enough as it is of, a lot of self-hating. We had quite a few self-hating Jews, but plenty of them were embarrassed enough as it is of different works of Chazal. Many scholars in Germany, Jewish scholars, didn't really want to admit that Safrut Heichalot was real. They didn't want to admit to themselves. They didn't want to confess that perhaps these were actual texts of the Tanaim. Because if they confessed that, then they would also be confessing that the Tanaim were kind of strange. And they would rather have assumed that these texts were just forgeries and later Gaonic era stuff that Jews wrote in their spare time because they liked magic. That's what they would have preferred. It wasn't until Gershom Scholem came in the early 1940s where he said, no. This was one of the premier scholars of Jewish mysticism. Said, no, we have to take this for what it's worth. We have to take it. We have to take the possibility seriously that these were written by the Tanaim. And he began the very mature task of trying to understand these through the lens of Tanoic worldview. And it's a very important thing. Now, when you fast forward 60 years and 80 years, a massive amount of scholarship has grown around the Safrut Heichalot, whether it was in the 40s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. There has been so much scholarship that it's its own field now. And Meir Bar Ilan walked into this field in the 80s, and he said, not getting into even the scope of dating the Safrut Heichalot right away. He wants to say, let's open these Sfarim and see what tefillot are in them, and let's see how valuable they are for studying tefillah in general. We cannot date with certainty many of the books of the Heichalot. Many of them at this point, many scholars believe, for example, Sefer Yetzirah is extremely early, and parts of Heichalot Rabbati are very early. But there are books there that we can't date with certainty. But maybe if we take them for their liturgical value, we could learn a lot about both how the liturgy in Eretz Yisrael, because these books are probably from Eretz Yisrael, how the liturgy in Eretz Yisrael evolved, and we can learn about something about the dating of the Safrut Heichalot, of the literature of the Sfarim of that discuss Heichalot and Merkava mysticism, so to speak. And as I was struggling with preparing this shiur, I was wondering, like, could I find anybody who talks about Ein Ke'Elokeinu? And I noticed that some people said that there were similar like prayers of the angels like this in different books of the Heichalot. In passing, certain, some footnotes mention that in the Safrut Heichalot, there are songs of the angels like this. So I figured when I got to the library this week, I would check Meir Bar Ilan's work because, he was the person to go to when essentially he looked at all these different songs of the Malachim and tefillot of the Tanaim and tefillot of the Malachim. And he what's it called? And he studies them. Lucky for me, very early in the book, he has a couple pages on Ein Ke'Elokeinu. And he found it in two places. He found it, first of all, in the Sefer Shiur Koma, and he found it in the Sefer, I think it was, this is in Raziel this is in Masechet Merkava, I think. So in the first source in Shiur Koma, he finds it like this. It's basically Lecha Hashem Agdula V'Agvur V'Tferes V'Nesa V'Ahod Ki Kol Hashemayim V'Aretz. This is, I believe, a shir of the Malachim. And then the Malachim say, Mi Ka'Adonenu, Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Ke'Malkeinu, Mi Ke'Malshenu. You'll notice that the first stanza is backwards. Instead of saying Mi Ke'Elokeinu, Mi Kadonenu, it says Mi Kadonenu, Mi Kemal, and Mi Ke'Elokeinu. And I'm displaying it here on my screen for anybody listening along. Next, you'll look at the text and you realize that this is a little different. It's Mi Ein Nodeh. Then it says Nivarech Le'Elokeinu and Nivarech Ladunenu. And the last stanza is Niromeim Le'Elokeinu, Nivarech Ladunenu, Nishabeach Le'Malkeinu, Nifa'er Le'Moshienu. And if you look at the version in Maseh Merkavah, he has a similar prayer of the Malachim. It says V'shalosh pa'amim b'chol yom v'yom kisei kvodo mishtatech lefanav ve'omer hitkabed v'li shenemar kadosh 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 Hashem tzevakod malei kol haaretz kvodo Mika Hashem Elokeinu, Mika Adonenu, Mika Malkeinu, Miki Yotzreinu, Ein Kadosh Hashem Ki Yemotecha Ve'ein Sur Ke'Elokeinu. So we find 2 times in the Safrut Heichalot that this idea was that these prayers are recorded. Furthermore, he had a very interesting ha'ara. He says if you look at Masechet Sofrim, where there is an instruction for the Pisukim to say when we take out the Sefer Torah. We say, Mi kamocha bekilim Hashem, Mi kamocha neder b'kodesh. Then we say, Ein kamocha be'elokim Hashem, ve'en k'ma'asecha. Clearly, in the time of Masechet Sofrim, stringing together 2 Pisukim, one which begins with Mi, and the next one which begins with En, was sensible. And the Rishonim say as much. The Rishonim say that the reason for the order of Mi Ke'Elokeinu and then Ein Ke'Elokeinu is because it's a question with an answer. Mi Ke'Elokeinu is asking who is like our God, and the response is Ein Ke'Elokeinu. There is no one like our God. I believe that he speculates that perhaps originally the Nusach was Nivarech in most of the sources, but later it got changed to Baruch, from Nivarech to Baruch, in order to create the desired acrostic, meaning that the acrostic itself isn't original, but the acrostic was the acrostic itself isn't original, but rather the entire tefillah was changed from Atu Elokeinu, from Nevarech Elokeinu to Atu Elokeinu, because they wanted to turn it into Amen Baruch Ata. And it's here in 1987 where we reach a dead end. After this, we just don't have any more information to speak of when it comes to Ein Ke'Elokeinu. I regret to inform you, there's just nothing there. Nobody has done any further work. In the Geniza, as far as I know, we haven't found much more in terms of useful information. But finding it in the Safrut Heichalot means that it's definitely from the Gaonic era or earlier. And what exactly it was written for, we don't know. Perhaps it became a popular song because people associated it with the Shira of the Malachim, and therefore it became a popular song to sing. Because we have 2 more minutes, let me show you a little bit about the Shir Shel Yom. And just in case we have time, I think we could spare 1 minute. Now, the Shir Shel Yom, of course, is a Mishnah, I believe, in Tamid, which lists the shirim that the Leviim would say every day. And I'm going to share my screen here. And there were different minhagim in the time of the Rishonim. I hope I have more time to speak about this next week. There are different minhagim as to what to do. Should you say the entire thing? Should you say, like, this is the song which the Leviim said ala duchan, and then say the whole thing? Or should you just say the brisa? Should you just say, well, on this day they said this, on this day they said that? So if you look at the Spanish Siddur in the Badlein from the early 1300s, you could already see that there was a minhag for people to say the entire thing. And I thought originally that people didn't say the entire thing, but I was wrong. Furthermore, the Sfaradi minhag of adding Tefillah LeDavid Hatei Hashem Oznacha Aneni Va'aneni and similar pisukim goes way back to the 1300s, which I thought was fascinating. Beit Yaakov L'chu V'nei Lecha. They wouldn't say it in the beginning, but they would say it at the end. And this collection of pisukim and why it was chosen is a complete mystery. This is attested to in some of the Rishonim, but why were these pesukim? Till this day, I have no idea why Beit Yaakov L'chu V'nei Lecha was chosen. And this florilegium of pesukim was chosen to be said after the Shirat Hayom. You do see here, Ein Kadosh Hashem Kim Betecha Ve'ein Tzur Ke'Elokeinu, Ein Mikimi Ala Ba'alei Hashem Mitzur Zalti Elokeinu, Ein Ke'Elokeinu, Ein Kadonenu. The minhag of saying Kaveh al Hashem in the Sfaradi Sidurim is more recent. That comes from the printed Sidurim. I don't believe Kaveh is in any of the manuscripts. It was the printers who added it in for some reason. But as you could see, the Sfaradi Nusach does go way back it's just mysterious as to why so much of this text was added here. The Rambam seems to say that it was a minority custom. Not everybody would say Shir Shel Yom. Not everybody would say Ein Ke'Elokeinu in his time. It seems that it kind of snowballed, that at a certain point, the Shir Shel Yom and the Beit Yaakov L'chu Ne'elecha and the Ein Ke'Elokeinu became not optional parts of the prayer. Rather, they became mandatory. I believe in their time it was understood to be optional, but this is what happens with the Siddur. Often things that are popular, things that are deemed important, things that especially are given theological gravity, like they're given weight. Those like the Amen Baruch Atah, those things get printed and those things become important. And for one reason or another, our Siddur gets longer every single 100 years. So with that, we will finish our class on Ein Ke'Elokeinu. I hope in the future I will learn more. I will find more scholarship on this, or I myself will, God willing, continue the conversation of this very interesting piyut. It is probably a very early piyut. It is probably it is possibly as far back as comes from something as some Sfarim as far back as the Amoraim, but more than that, we just don't know much more about Ein Ke'Elokeinu, and it survives in our Siddur until this day. B'ezrat Hashem next week, I hope, if we don't have to spend too much time on the Pitum Aktoret, we could continue next week with Aleinu and discuss the history of that text. So thank you for your time and attention, and we will continue next week. It's recording here in the end for anybody who needs the audio of this Jewish prayer Ein Ke'Elokeinu that you could find on YouTube.
Non como nuestro Dios, non como nuestro Señor, non como nuestro Rey, non como nuestro Salvador. Mi Ke'Elokeinu, mi Kadonenu, mi Ke'Elokeinu, mi Ke'Moshienu, quien como nuestro Dios, quien como nuestro Señor, quien como nuestro Rey, quien como nuestro Salvador. No del Eloheinu, no del Adonenu, no del Malkeinu, no del Moshienu. Lo haremos a nuestro Dios, lo haremos a nuestro Señor, lo haremos a nuestro Rey, lo haremos a nuestro Salvador. Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu. Bendito nuestro Dios, bendito nuestro Señor, bendito nuestro Rey, bendito nuestro Salvador. Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu. Tú sos nuestro Dios. Tú sos nuestro Señor, tú sos nuestro Rey, tú sos nuestro Salvador.